Thanks so much, Rod. Yeah, Hack Miami was an awesome event. That was the probably one and only time where you could present in front of the audience wearing shorts, which I did take advantage of, and I thought, wow, this is probably the only time I will be able to do that. So that was quite, yeah, it was refreshing. All right, so I love this event. Again, second time attending, first time speaking. No, I guess it's bring your own whiskey shots, so no shots today. But yeah, hopefully this is a fun and interesting presentation. Not super technical, but what I'll try to do is to go into. I'm not going to spend the time on what is ransomware, right? Hopefully everyone knows that, but I'll talk a little bit, tiny bit about how it works, but most importantly, how we as defenders try to stop, detect, and stop ransomware, and why the industry has been pretty much failing at that. Because obviously we all read the news, right? And we see, I remember earlier today, Jen was mentioning ransomware attacks that hit about 20 cities in Texas. But we all heard about a number of cities in Florida, of course Baltimore, of course Atlanta, but it seemed like all over the place, right? Every week there's another ransomware attack. So how come our defenses are ineffective? So we'll double click on the current solutions that the industry put forward, and then we'll look also at a handful of examples of interesting ransomware. And yeah, and then we'll try to do a couple of demos, one or two, depending on how we go, how time is. So let's get going. Quick intro: Rene, Kolga. As Rod mentioned, been in the security space for some time, mostly in the areas of patch management, encryption, anti-malware, and insider threat. Okay. So this is my mandatory scare slide, as every security presentation needs to have a scary slide, right? But this one is mostly about ransomware. I'm not going to talk, I already mentioned a bunch of the examples earlier, but the one that caught my eye is this one, $194 billion is, I think, a study by Oxford University that they estimated that a hypothetical coordinated global ransomware attack could have this level of impact, right? And WannaCry, I think, had the impact of about $4 billion. So they said for a really well-coordinated worldwide ransomware attack, it can reach almost 200 billion. So that's pretty scary. Okay, but let's not dwell on that. Let's move forward. So, as I mentioned, I'm not going to also talk about how exactly ransomware works and how it gets into our systems, right? That's the attack vector is irrelevant. That can be phishing, of course, the most common vector, but it can be RDP, insecure RDP, where Samsung Group loves that attack vector, where they get in through account password stuffing or password spraying and various other attacks. But ransomware will get in, we know that. And then what ransomware does, it obviously tries to go through the find files that matter to you and your organization. And often those would be Office extensions, sometimes images as well, and then the ransomware would encrypt it. Ransomware would obviously skip the OS files, because ransomware wants to make sure your OS still boots, right? To show that scare message and ask you for bitcoins, right? Who knows when did ransomware start? What year? Any guesses?
2009.
2009, good guess. Anyone else? Come on, random numbers.
2000?
2000. 1980 something. That is the right answer, actually. If you Wikipedia, well, so it's 1989, I believe. If you look on Wikipedia, there is a story about some researcher actually shipping floppies around with ransomware back in 1989. So obviously it's not something very new. It's been around for a while. Of course, the proliferation of cryptocurrencies and Tor really amped up the popularity of ransomware. So it's much easier to extract money, and it's much harder to track down the attackers. So that's why ransomware is indeed so popular. And some say, well, you know, FBI, of course, encourages you not to pay, right? And which makes sense. We don't want to fund the criminals, right? But imagine you are a hospital, right? You have critical operations scheduled, dozens per day, right? And your electronic health record system is down. You don't know what blood type this person on the operation table needs, right? What do they have some drug combination issues, drug resistance, etc., right? Even if you have a backup, right? How long will it take you to get back from a backup? That can take days, maybe weeks. Even if your backup exists, it wasn't corrupted by the attackers, and actually restores, right? It can still take days, if not weeks. So that's why some organizations, especially in the healthcare space, end up paying ransom, because it's just faster to get back in business. Okay, so, and I'm not obviously advocating that, just stating the reality, because some folks say, well, just don't pay ransom, right? It's not that easy. Your business may depend on that, and you may not have a backup. What should you do? Close your doors? Or do you pay, right? So that's a decision, very much a decision per each incident, per each organization. So, but back to ransomware and how it works. So we decided we're not going to talk about how it gets in, but what happens afterwards, right? It looks for the data that is valuable. It then reads that data, those files, encrypts them, encrypts the data in memory, and then it has a number of ways of destroying the original file and replacing it with the encrypted version. And normally it happens one of the three ways. You can see there on the right of the slide. It's either ransomware, after encrypting data in memory, deletes the original file and creates a new file. So that's easy enough. Another one, and probably the most devious one, it's overwriting the content of the original file without even changing the name or the file extension. And why it's devious is because then it makes it harder for you to understand which files are encrypted, which files are not encrypted, which files to restore, etc. So that makes restoration trickier. And the last one, ransomware can create a new file that's encrypted and then use a rename operation to replace the original file with the encrypted version. So that just giving you a little bit of the detail on what happens exactly after ransomware encrypted the data in memory, because by understanding how it works at the last stage of its nefarious activity, you know how to, or you hope to understand how to detect and hopefully block and prevent that activity, right? Clear so far? Okay. Yes. So now let's look at the detection methods that the industry has been putting forward in the past years, if not decades, right? So, and I'll go through five methods. Of course, there are more, but let's just start with five. I think. cut off? No, it's good. So static file analysis. This is the same method as the antivirus, anti-malware, and other tools used to detect regular malware, right? It's looking for some kind of a signature, can be some particular word, right? Ransom, right? Or looking for file extensions that the ransomware targets. Or something similar, right? So this is your typical signature-based or machine learning-based approach of detecting malware. Same applies to ransomware. And with every method, there are pros and cons, right? The pros here, very low false positive rate, very low FP rate. Antivirus is pretty good at tuning that ratio of FPs quite low, right? Turning it down. So pretty rarely, an antivirus would detect a file and claim that this file is malicious while it's actually not malicious, while it's benign. So that's a benefit, right? Because we're all overwhelmed with alerts already. The alert fatigue, big deal, right? So important to have a low FP rate. It's obviously signature-based and machine learning-based approaches have decent, but actually I would say pretty high level of efficacy against known malware or small modifications of the known malware. So it will stop a wide variety of attacks. And then a super important benefit is it will stop the encryption before a single file is encrypted, right? Before any damage is done. So that's pretty important. So not a single file will get encrypted. So that's positive. What are the cons? Well, obviously with the signature and then machine learning algorithms, the FN rate, right, the false negative rate is quite high, right? For anything besides the very known malware, attackers are smart. They use cryptors, they use packers. It's so easy to modify the hash or use other techniques to modify your malware to look like something quite new. So, in fact, we recently did, with our research team, we tested the efficacy of top 3 anti-malware solutions, big vendors, known vendors, against not the unknown, the cool, cutting-edge stuff, but against really old malware. We took 30,000 malware samples, known malware samples from like a decade ago, literally super old stuff. And then we took another 30,000 samples from like a year or so, a year ago. And we tested the efficacy of the top of the top antivirus solutions against that. And what we saw, it's, the results were far from perfect. With single byte modification of, so this is the original samples, right? No modification. All known samples, all known to VirusTotal, right? And you can see one vendor did 99.9. That's, not bad, right? Other vendors were a little bit lower. But when we did a single byte modification, I like this funny sample. This program cannot be run in DOS mode. Modifying it to this program cannot be run in dog mode, right? That was enough to for the efficacy to drop down to 60% or 89% for this vendor. Does that make sense? Right. So that's just an example of how easy it is, even for very known old malware, to evade AV detection.
So that one change caused these fluctuations in numbers?
Exactly. So this was the original sample from 10 years ago to a few years ago, and that was the same sample with just single byte modification. And as you can see, the efficacy dropped dramatically. Right. We did another test, which is separate story, where you just disconnect the system from the internet. And you know how much, what the efficacy is then? It dropped to as low as 34%. Because that's where the cloud databases where the vendors store their file reputation, their signatures these days. They can't have all the billion sample signatures on each system, right? So they rely heavily on their cloud intelligence. If you just unplug the cable from your system and bring in malware through, I don't know, thumb drive, for example, the efficacy, even for the old known stuff, drops to as low as 34%. Pretty scary, right? Okay, so we discussed the first first detection method. Let's look at another one. Common file extension blacklist. So this is a little bit, I would say, a little bit basic or silly detection method. So I can't, first when I read about this, I was like, no, this can't be. No one is just trying to detect ransomware by the file extension they use after they encrypt the file, right? Or was I wrong, right? I'll show you a screenshot of a well-known product where I masked the logo that states exactly that. So literally what an antivirus or next-gen AV solution is doing is looking for appearance of file extensions that are known to be used by well-known ransomware. So it does have some positives, right? It's again low FP rate. It can stop the damage after, I guess, maybe not no damage, but one file was encrypted, and then it may be able to stop it. But obviously, it's super trivial to bypass. Just don't use that file extension on their blacklist, or create a random file extension, or even better or worse, just don't change file extension at all. Just rewrite the file as it was. So as promised, there's well-known security product, and if you look at the third, that radio button, file encryption, a process that created a file with a known ransomware extension was terminated. So literally a checkbox to enable a feature in a security product to block ransomware by the file extension. So, all right. Here's another way the industry is trying to combat ransomware. Okay, next one. That's an interesting one. Honeypot files, or bait files, or deception. That's where products create kind of bait files on your servers or your laptops, desktops. And if a ransomware process touches that file, then we caught the fish, right? So we should terminate that process that touched those bait files. So there's some pluses, right? It potentially will be able to detect. This method will potentially be able to detect ransomware that is not known. It's the unknown new variant. It's that a static file analysis, signatures, or machine learning can't detect. So that's great. And of course, the downsides are significant here as well. In most cases, those bait files are just are marked as hidden in system. So obviously, so that the user, the end user of the system, wouldn't touch them and trigger the alarm, right? But an obvious option for an attacker would be to just skip hidden and/or system files, right? That's pretty easy. And of course, another big downside is that many files will likely get encrypted before ransomware touches those bait files. So we already have some damage, potentially significant damage, before the defense mechanisms will trigger, right? So, okay. And now moving on into the last two, and these are more sophisticated, more advanced methods with decent degree of efficacy. So mass file operations. Obviously, ransomware. What's the purpose of ransomware, right? It reads your files, it encrypts them, and writes them back to disk. So a lot of operations, often within pretty limited amount of time. So if you can create some triggers, looking for the rename, write, and read or delete operations within a certain period of time, you can detect this anomalously high level of disk activity that can be associated with ransomware. Right? Of course, there are false positives where you're just moving folders from one to another or something like that. So again, it has the pro. It can detect malware that the static file analysis would not. But on the downside, again, the tool will likely wait for this trigger. 100 files encrypted within 30 seconds, right? And only after that it will trigger the defensive mechanism. So obviously some damage will be done already. And then ransomware writers, of course, are pretty smart as well. They have access to all these technologies that we, the defenders, have also. So what they do sometimes, they add delays between encryptions to kind of spread that period out, so not all files get encrypted within a few seconds or minutes. So that may help them avoid those triggers, or they spawn multiple processes. So if even one process gets committed as malicious and terminated, the other encryption processes will continue in parallel. And I'll show an example of ransomware that does just that later. And the last one, probably the most sophisticated, one of the more sophisticated ones, it's where a security product is looking for the rate of change and applies, for example, an entropy calculation to files to see, to measure the randomness of data there, and doing that to detect the encryption activity. Again, it has some positives, and especially this one, that it has fewer false positives versus the previous one, where the previous method could, if you're just moving one folder to another, that could trigger it. This, the calculation of entropy would not change, and hence this method would not get triggered in the benign file system activity. While if it is a malicious ransomware activity, it may get triggered. So that's a decent detection method. Obviously, again, some damage will be done because the security product will need to reach certain level of confidence, certain trigger, before it will stop the encryption. And then ransomware also tries to spawning multiple processes, adding delays, as well as sometimes encrypting just chunks of files or parts of files instead of encrypting the full file. And by doing that, they may evade that entropy-based detection. So that's kind of those are the highlights of different detection methods. I tried to summarize them all here and rate them. This is my very scientific rating of those methods from 1 to 5. And as you can see, none of them reach even 4, not to mention 5. So again, this is not scientific rating. It's just applying basic logic here, and that's why most security products actually try to combine multiple, if not all, of these methods to try to detect and stop ransomware. And even though again, by reading the news, we can realize that this is still not enough, right? These methods, even together, they're not very effective. So I think it's time for a little demo now. Where are my Mr. Robot fans here? Anyone watching? I brought my Aled Elderson All Safe Security badge here, so I wanted to dress up as Mr. Robot, but I thought that may be a little bit of an overkill here. But Mr. Robot, for those who have not been watching, it's in its fourth and last season right now as we speak. And it's a pretty fun show. I wouldn't say it's the most realistic hacking show, but it's certainly the most technical hacking show that has ever been on TV. And the reason being is they actually hired some legit security experts. I think CSO of Tanium is part of the advisory team, and a number of other security, true security experts have been advising them. And you can see what's cool about the show. Also, you can see both the offensive tools as well as the security tools in the show. Like you see real products and real scripts and tools, which is pretty fun. And yeah, too bad it's ending, but I'm looking forward to the last few episodes soon. So why do I mention Mr. Robot? Well, in one of the episodes they used what's called a rubber ducky. Right, many of you are probably familiar with rubber ducky, right? I don't know how many of you played with rubber ducky. So let's have some fun here. So this, well, let's see. So you buy it off the internet, right? I think it's $50. It comes in this beautiful blue package, and it you open it and it looks like this. Well, what does this look like? Like a thumb drive, right? Exactly, so benign, right? So I still once in a while see vendors giving thumb drives at security conferences. I'm like, wow, really? Okay, so let's see what we can do with rubber ducky, right? For those who have not played with it, hopefully that will be interesting. So let's do this. First, I'm gonna duplicate my screen. Imagine here I have on my desktop some super valuable data, right? This super important photo, for example, of my cat who stole all of my bitcoins, but Bitcoin's kind of down, so I still love the cat. So it would be terrible if something bad happens to this photo. It's the only photo of the cat before he stole the bitcoins. So let's let me first disable some security here. Don't try this at home, or do try this at home. My security team always gets upset with me for demoing things on my own. On our corporate laptop. Okay, let's see. So I just need to disable some security, because if I don't, it's going to be a very boring demo. So I'm switching from the prevention mode to just detection mode for the sake of a demo. Yeah, we're good. We're in detection. Okay, so we have a super valuable data here. And now the only thing I'm going to do, I'm just going to plug this thumb drive and let's see what happens. Okay, not touching anything. Oh, suddenly someone is typing on my screen, and then the screen slides over. Well, what happened, right? Well, for those, and it's by now it's game over. So I can I can unplug the thumb drive. The damage is done. So for those who have not played with Rubber Ducky, it's actually not a thumb drive. It's a keyboard emulator. So anything that your keyboard can do, this Rubber Ducky can be programmed to do. So, and unless so some would say, well, we block USBs. We use device control in our company, so you can't plug in a USB drive. Well, again, this is not a USB drive. It's a keyboard. Unless you block keyboards in your company, this will work. So, what they did after I plugged it in, it literally typed fileless malware or fileless ransomware into memory. So there's no binary to scan. It's literally typing ransomware into memory. And as you can see, my cat is gone. It got encrypted. So obviously, for the demo purposes, this ransomware was designed to only encrypt one file on my desktop. However, in the real world, it could have encrypted my whole disk, Or it could have wiped my MBR, or it could have exfiltrated all of the data from this system to a system somewhere in Estonia, or it could have deployed a keylogger or anything else, right? So, and it just took it, 15 or 30 seconds of this device being plugged in to type that attack into memory and execute it. I've tested this with most antivirus and other products I could get my hands on, and not a single one of them was able to detect or prevent this attack. Anyone wants to try this on your laptop, come afterwards, we'll have some fun. So, cool. So, and why did I show this? Well, this is just to illustrate the unpredictability of badness, right? I like to say the bad guys are just so good, right? If the only thing you're doing is trying to detect what's bad, you will always be playing the cat and mouse game. You will always be behind. Well, some days you win, other days you lose, right? Because the attackers, their past actions are not indicative of their future actions. There will always be another vector, another exploit, another 0-day, etc. Okay, so that was fun, hopefully. Well, let's continue. And I'll try to show another demo at the end if we have some time. So, okay, so we started with briefly talking about how ransomware interacts with the file system after it gets into your system, right? Then we looked at the 5 detection methods for ransomware that the security industry has been applying so far. Seen a cool demo. So now let's look at just a handful of examples of ransomware from not distant past that I thought were quite interesting for one reason or another. So here's a CryptoMix, not necessarily a super sophisticated ransomware, but here is where psychology comes into play, right? It's not just about technology, it's also about psychology. So in this case, paying ransom sucks, right? You feel like a loser, right? So, or your organization feels really bad. So what if the ransomware, what if the attackers tell you that your ransom goes to poor children, to help sick children, right? So suddenly, well, if either the portion of your ransom or your whole ransom goes to poor children, right? Suddenly maybe paying ransom doesn't feel that bad anymore, right? And that's exactly what these guys are saying. They claim to be, let's see, we are the International Children Charity Organization. Your money will be spent for the children charity, etc., right? Not in great English, but they claim they literally show you profiles of children, real children that I think they hacked from some database of some real charity. So they bring some legit elements into it to try to convince you that you paying them ransom is not such a bad thing after all. So obviously no money goes to children, I can assure you of that.
I mean, so they're somebody's children.
Probably. They also have children, right? So that's what he was saying. The attackers often have children too, right? They want to eat and go to Disneyland. So that's where technology is combined with psychology to get you to pay. So I found that to be quite fascinating. Another relatively recent example, Locker Goga, not Locker Gaga. So this one is the one that attacked the Norwegian aluminium producer, Norsk Hydro. And here you see the story from March of this year where it says it cost them $40 million. Since then, I've seen multiple other stories that I think said either $65 million or $85 million, one attack. And in some other stories regarding this particular attack, I read that the Norsk Hydro actually had like a next-gen antivirus or anti-ransomware product installed, and Kolga was still able to bypass it. And what they did there is exactly, as I mentioned in one of the detection method bypasses, was to Kolga launched multiple threads, literally a thread per file, and hence the encryption was super slow, but maybe that's the reason it was so effective, actually. Yeah, question?
So when they throw out numbers like that, what are they calculating?
So that's a great question. How is anyone coming up with these numbers? Like, remember the city of Atlanta, right? It started with the ransom was, I think, $51,000 or $55,000. The latest stat, the latest bill I saw was, I think, $17 or $18 million. So Atlanta didn't pay 50 or so K to the attackers, and then they ended up spending $17 or $18 million. So how these numbers are calculated, it really depends on the type of the organization, the vertical they're in. For example, if you are in healthcare, right, you will be, you may or may not be fined, because if the data wasn't actually leaked, and you can say, well, ransomware just encrypted data on our system, so no data got leaked, so HIPAA we shouldn't be fined for the PHI leak. In other cases, ransomware actually can expose data as well as encrypt data. In that case, there is a defined set of fines that the healthcare organization will have to pay the government for the PHI leak. In the case of industries like Norse, or there was I think Maersk shipping company, right, that was hit by NotPetya, if I'm not mistaken, and I think their estimate was $300 million loss, and that's literally a lost business, right? They calculate their downtime with the shipping very easy, right? We couldn't. These boats who weren't able to leave the port, we know exactly how much do we make from each boat and each container loaded on the boat. There's the number, right? And it's a publicly traded company, so they have to actually reveal the exact number in their quarterly reports. Same with Norsk Hydro. One of their facilities that was they are producers of aluminium, but they do other things as well. One of their facilities in one of the countries was down for X number of days or weeks, so they can relatively easily put a number to that. They know their productivity per hour, etc. Right. Cool. Any other questions so far? Yeah. Okay, the last example, this one is Chimera. It's actually relatively old ransomware, but it ties nicely to just my comments around PHI and healthcare ransomware. This is where, again, psychology comes into play, not necessarily a sophisticated ransomware from the technological perspective, but what they claim in their ransom note, that if you don't pay, all of this data will be released to the public with your contact information. So depending on who you are, what kind of data you had, and what type of organization you are with, if someone says, well, if you don't pay up, we're gonna leak all the photos or all whatever databases and everything you had, that may be pretty scary. So this is, you can even call this doxingware rather than ransomware, right? They dox you if you don't pay, or at least they promise to do so. Actually, further investigation revealed that the ransomware didn't necessarily have this capability, but they just tried to scare you into thinking that they will, which is, I think, is pretty smart and scary and devious. Okay, so lots of scary stuff. And what do we do about this, right? My intention was to just highlight how ransomware behaves and what so far what have we done to try to stop it, to various levels of success. But let me end with just a few highlights, obviously, on what every organization need to be doing to try to be a harder target for ransomware and other attacks, right? These no rocket science here, right? Patch early and often, right? We keep hearing that. I can't believe that in 2019 we're still talking about patch management. Unfortunately, that's still an unsolved problem. I mean, forget patch management. In some audiences, I ask the folks and say, well, can anyone tell me how many Windows 7 systems do you have in your environment? Very few people can actually answer the basic asset management questions. Forget the patch management, right? If you don't know what you have, how can you secure it, right? So it starts with the basics, right? Knowing your environment and then applying the basic security hygiene. Just getting those patches out is a huge deal. It literally closes 90% of the holes. If not 95, 98. Backup is good to have, right? Even though it may take you a while to get back in business, even with a working backup, but definitely something that is smart to have. And of course, the attackers also think about that. So many ransomware samples, they actually attempt to delete your VSS snapshots, right? Your volume shadow copy. If you're on Windows, they try to corrupt your backups. So make sure your backups are actually isolated or read-only. That if you get admin privileges on this on any box, you are not going to be able to corrupt or wipe your backups. Super important. And then my pet peeve kind of is the last one. We've been so in security industry, and I've been part of it myself. We're so bent and so focused on chasing the bad, right? We study what the attackers are doing. All these great companies have hundreds of researchers, and every day what they do, they study what the attackers are doing, right? The new samples, the new attacks techniques. We monitor the hacker forums, etc., etc. But that is still cat and mouse game, right? If the only thing you focus on is trying to predict the future badness, you'll always be behind. And that's why I implore everyone in the organizations to make sure you combine those tools. I'm not saying antivirus is bad, you need to run home and uninstall it immediately. No, by any stretch of the imagination. Those are good tools, and no tool is perfect. But what is smart is to combine the tools that look for what's bad, whether it's signature, AI, machine learning, whatever, with the tools that ensure the good, which is more of the whitelisting approach, right? Whether it's application whitelisting, OS behavior whitelisting, app isolation, micro-virtualization, OS hardening. There's not a single tool, but it's important to combine the negative security model-based tools with the positive security model-based tools, and only then you're able to achieve what I call a true defense in depth, where you have multiple layers of defense that are not applying exactly the same technique, just maybe a little bit better, but apply the exact opposite techniques, and that really increases your chances of having decent protection. Cool? Any other questions before I show another demo, if it works? Questions? Everyone's scared? Yeah.
Do you have any comments as to the issues around Baltimore, Florida, and those ransomware attacks?
About what?
About Baltimore, Florida. Yeah. I don't know if you want to comment on those.
Well,
What were they not using, or they were not effective? The ones that they had, or they just didn't have it?
Well, yeah, so one of the most known attacks, ransomware, one of the most public, some of the most public attacks have been on the municipalities, right? It's the state and local government, like Baltimore, City of Atlanta. Baltimore actually got ransomware multiple times. The other day I was reading about, I think it was in Johannesburg, South Africa, ransomware, right? So, you know, I think Atlanta was SamSam. They got through RDP, and they, you know, took their time to study the environment. They took their time to plant the ransomware in the most valuable, you know, areas of the organization, and then they encrypted it at, you know, at the right time when folks are out over the weekend, for example, right? So they used all the best practices of ransomware attack, right? And yes, obviously the organization wasn't prepared, right? They didn't have the right backups. They didn't have the combination of ensuring good and chasing bad, right? They just had basic AV, and as we looked at all the detection methods that AV as well as next-gen AV applies, none of them are really effective, right? The only thing that's effective is a defense in depth or multiple tools applied correctly. And I'm sure they weren't great at patching either. So, but yeah.
So are you aware of anybody that has had ransomware that failed and didn't work effectively?
Well, most other companies that this is not something that happens, you know, once a year or, you know, to every 100th or 1,000th organization. This is something that happens every day. Most organizations are attacked thousands of times a day. So yes, most organizations actually have been saved by the tools they have. We are just hearing about the bad. Yeah.
Like, has anybody that has had ransomware tools? Sorry, I didn't know myself right. Where the ransomware tools failed then, and they still got ransomware. That's what I meant to say. Have you heard of any of that?
The ransomware.
Any ransomware getting through any ransomware tools?
Ransomware getting through the anti-ransomware tool, right?
Yeah,
well,
sorry, anti-ransomware.
Yeah. So every antivirus claims to be anti-ransomware. So every single story you hear about successful ransomware means they bypassed the anti-ransomware protection. Every single one of them. There's not a single company out there that doesn't have a firewall and AV installed, right? And they still get breached. So that's why I went through the pros and cons of the detection methods that those tools deploy and how easy it is to bypass them. And the proof is in the news, unfortunately. Okay.
I just wanted to add, it's not even about the tool. Most of the malware or ransomware you see isn't necessarily exploiting a missing patch. It may just be getting in through a default password. Right? A default password, easy to guess password. Atlanta, for example, RDP, they most likely got through passwords that were leaked through a previous breach.
Yeah, password spraying or stuffing, password stuffing, right? Account stuffing.
Most of the tools are not going to detect that.
Exactly. So that's very good point, right? And that's why it's important to combine various tools together, various defensive tools together, is because, yeah, if someone walks through your door, right, and they have a key, right, obviously they will get through the door. Now, so that the perimeter defense failed. So now what other tools do you have in your arsenal to detect their, you know, follow-up activities, follow-on activities, right? Hopefully that makes sense.
So is it better just to have your own VPN? I mean, does that provide the additional protection that you think you need from ransomware? You know, even as a home user, right?
Yeah, as a home user, the suggestions stand: patch, Make sure you're always up to date, and I don't mean just Windows or Mac OS, whatever you have, right? But also all the applications that you use, your Office or again, your browser, right? So super important. Of course, having an up-to-date anti-malware product, antivirus product is also is a good barrier. Again, it's not going to give you even 99% protection, but it's good to have. Online backup, right? Hopefully we all use some online backup tool in case the ransomware gets through. So absolutely, the VPN will not do anything for you as a home user. It's not going to have any efficacy against or for ransomware. So okay, let me switch to this system, and I'll show a pretty brief, interesting demo, hopefully, and then I'm happy to answer more questions. Let's see. So this is something I have never shown to any audience, any kind of wide audience. But this is another very interesting evasion technique that has not been publicly announced yet, so you are kind of an exclusive audience to see this. So it's another example of how ransomware or viruses can evade your defenses, how easily they can do that. So what we have here in this VM, we just leverage a Microsoft anti-ransomware tool or settings. Ransomware, you can see ransomware protection. In Windows 10 it's called Controlled Folder Access, or CFA. So basically Windows 10 by default claims to protect you from ransomware. And there's a list of folders that's it. So all the documents and settings all are protected. So this is a default configuration of CFA. And here's a folder, one of the folders that are protected. And say we have some important information here, a few important files, right? And here's our procmon to see what happens, what transpires. So let's launch kind of, let's attempt to encrypt those 4 files using kind of a vanilla ransomware technique, right? Let's see, ransomware. Okay, so if you look at procmon, you'll see what happens. So ransomware.exe, just kind of example ransomware that we built, attempted to encrypt these files. You can see the details, right? And it got access denied. So Microsoft defenses worked as advertised, right? CFA blocked the attempts to encrypt these 4 files, and the files are saved. So now let's switch to this interesting evasion technique that we have discovered recently, and let's see what happens. Okay, so that's interesting. First, so again, you can see replays.exe, a different executable, got success on 4 attempts. Okay, let's see if the files are still good. No. Okay, the files got encrypted. So, as you can see, this was a very simple bypass. Literally, the code is 2 lines of code to leverage this evasion technique, and voila, we were able to bypass control folder access in Windows 10, which is the ransomware protection technique. But what's even more important and more interesting here, I think some of the previous speakers mentioned tools called EDR, a class of tools called EDR, right? Endpoint detection and response. Those are the tools that are meant to be those security video cameras that record every interaction on the endpoint. And so if something bad happened and actually attackers were able to bypass our defenses, at least we'll have that recording of what transpired so we can investigate and hopefully fortify our defenses for the future attacks so the bad guys can't walk in like they did before. But to do that, obviously, EDR needs to see what transpired. But what's interesting to see here in Procmon, you can see that unlike with the vanilla ransomware, we saw what files it was trying to encrypt unsuccessfully. In this example, in the replace example, we see a blank. There's nothing. That's why we call this evasion technique also a blinding technique. That not only bypasses your security defenses, but it also leaves no trace behind to investigate what the hell happened. So that's just, I can show the same demo with semantic endpoint protection, with McAfee, Silence, etc., all the major security AV tools. This was just kind of a short and sweet example. Questions?
Can you see the content of replaced
It's just launches an executable underneath. The replace.bat file, it just launches the exe and prints this. This is the only reason
What are the 2 lines of code that
the 2 lines of code is obviously compiled, so you're not gonna show it here on the screen. It's just a legacy Windows system call that we were able to leverage for malicious purposes. Of course, we're going through responsible disclosure, right? Because this is a pretty dangerous technique. It falls in the wrong hands. We have not seen this used in the wild, so that's why we've been doing the rounds through the security industry, Microsoft and others, before we release this to the public.
Are you using the bat file for evasion purposes, or I'm just trying to figure out the reason for using the bat file?
The bat file is just to print, literally to print this.
Got it.
And underneath it just, so if we, let me do type. That's what, that's the content of the badge file.
I was just wondering if that was much more trusted by
No.
the vendor. I see.
No.
So, is the assumption that you launch this executable as a root user, as a regular user, non-admin, they won't launch it? I mean, they won't execute.
Yeah. So the question is, well, do you have to be a root or admin on the box in order to be able to execute it? I believe the answer is yes. However, it's not like the bad guys don't have ways to do privilege escalation, right? There are dozens of techniques of doing that. So, yeah.
For AV engines, if they are based on machine learning, is there anything they can do in order to kind of detect these kind of variations?
So, question, well, all these vendors now say, well, we're not just signatures, of course. We have the magical machine learning and AI and deep learning, right? What can they do about this? Well, machine learning, how are machine learning algorithms trained in anti-malware and anti-ransomware products? Those are trained on known old malware samples, right? So literally, the companies feed millions of samples into an algorithm to train it, right? So what does that mean? Does it mean that the machine learning algorithm will be able to detect those old known malicious samples? Yes. Does it mean that machine learning algorithm will be able to detect variants of those known old malware samples? Likely. Possibly. Does it mean it will be able to detect completely new, previously unseen attacks? Unlikely, right? So it's still chasing bad, right? Machine learning algorithm is just a broader signature that's easier for both the vendor to create and for the customer to deploy, because instead of thousands of signatures, it's one machine learning machine learning model per, say, 1,000 viruses, and then there's another machine learning for another, million viruses, et cetera, et cetera. So, but it's still a signature, right? So again, is the efficacy of ML-based AV tools higher than signature-based? Absolutely, right? But will it be able to stop, 99% of attacks? Definitely not. So that's why my suggestion is to combination of tools that look for what's bad with the tools that ensure the good.
I wonder, can your domain knowledge, your expertise in terms of assembling this kind of evasion actually help machine learning? One is to add this evasion as worst example as part of the training data. And also, can you come up with some features for the machine learning system to do better? Because you know the evasion, so when you're on the other side of the table,
No, absolutely. That's why we all in the industry share samples. That's why virus total is so important and powerful. Is because those all samples are used by vendors to improve their efficacy. But again, that is still chasing the bad, right? You'll still, many days you'll win, some days you'll lose. That's the only thing you're focused on. That's why I'm, with all the improvements, and yes, those are important, and yes, will contribute to those improvements with this sample and this evasion technique, but that's never going to solve your problem of malware or ransomware with high degree of confidence. Cool? All right, I know we're over time, so thanks so much. I really appreciate it.